Okra is one of my favorite vegetables, and we're using it again this season in one of our recipes. This one is a Garbanzo and Okra Gumbo. Now the interesting thing about this one is that it actually contains no meat. So if you wanted to make it vegetarian, you could. I'm not actually doing that today because I am going to use a vegetable or a chicken broth in it as opposed to the regular. I'm using 2 teaspoons of vegetable oil. You could use olive oil, canola oil, whatever you have handy, because we're going to have so many other flavors developing here that the oil is not as critical as some other things. We're going to get that a little bit toasty in our pan, and I've got it on a fairly high heat to get started. And then I have 1 large onion that I'm going to add to this and let that start the trinity. Now, gumbo traditionally has a trinity of 3 vegetables. It has onions, green peppers, and this is 1 large green pepper we're throwing in here, and celery. So we're going to throw those in, and we're going to stir those around and let them cook about 5 minutes on, depending on your range and your heat source, on a fairly high heat to a medium heat. For about 5 minutes, we want the onion to start becoming translucent. Once you get that translucency to the onion, everything else doesn't have to be cooked because we're going to have so much cooking going on later. I'm adding a clove of garlic that's been minced. We'll stir that in. Again, it doesn't have to stir in very long. I didn't stir it in earlier because I didn't want it to scorch, but I want to stir it in fairly well now and then get the next ingredient going, which is going to allow that garlic to continue to cook a little bit. I've got a tablespoon of flour that we're going to stir in there, and we're going to stir this down. Now, gumbo often has a roux as part of the base, and depending on how much flavor you want to develop and how much time you want to dedicate to it, this is often just flour and oil that's cooked for, can be hours. It requires a fair amount of guardianship so that you make sure it doesn't burn, but it can get anywhere from a light toasty brown to a very deep brown, and a lot of flavor develops as that happens. This is sort of a shortcut. Gumbo is traditionally a dish that has evolved. It has involved many cultures and developments. You get African involvement there, you get French, you get Cajun, you get Southern low-income folks that have added their influence to it, Mexican influence to it, and then we get the American Middle West influence going here. And so I'm not going to brown this as much because I don't have time, and that's not really what you would think of as a traditional gumbo. This is an evolved type of gumbo. So this is basically going to simply act as part of my thickening agent. Part of the additional thickening is going to come from the gumbo, or from the garlic, from the okra itself. So I've got that going, and what I'm going to add to it now is 2 cups of chicken stock. I'm going to add a little bit and stir it in just to make sure we don't have any lumps going on here. It's important at that early stage, while you're getting that flour browned a little bit, that you do stir fairly constant. And if you've let it go a little longer, or if the heat was a little bit higher, you may find at this point that you have some things on the bottom that you really want to stir in. Make sure that nothing scorches, nothing gets too brown, but you may want to stir up a little bit of those bits that you've developed on the bottom, and those will add a little bit more flavor. So that's the rest of our chicken stock. And now I'm going to add all the other ingredients. I've got about 4 cups of tomatoes. Now these could be whole tomatoes that you've canned, fresh tomatoes, save the juice if you're using those. And I'd probably peel them if they were fresh too, simply because you don't want those skins separating off into here. But you could use, if you're using commercially canned, diced, crushed, whatever you like. I'm also going to add the garbanzo beans, and these are going to take the place of our meat. I've got about 2 cups of garbanzo beans. If you cook them yourself, you can save a lot of sodium. If you buy the commercially canned ones, you're probably going to get a fairly high sodium content on this dish. The same with the tomatoes. If you're using canned tomatoes, choose those that haven't any salt added to them. The garbanzo beans can be cooked ahead and frozen plain, so you can just freeze a 2-cup package and be ready to go. Also to this, we're going to add several different seasonings to it. I've got a teaspoon of salt, and a half a teaspoon of black pepper. Stir those in well. I've got 2 bay leaves, and the trick to bay leaves, of course, is to remember to take them out when you're ready to serve, because you don't want anybody actually getting one of those in their dish. And then I've got 1/4 of a teaspoon of cayenne pepper, And this is going to shock you as we go through this and some of the things I'm adding to this, because gumbo is traditionally relatively spicy. So for me, a calm-mouthed northern kind of person, to add a tablespoon of Tabasco to anything is kind of a shocker. Then I'm also going to add a teaspoon of dried thyme. You have fresh thyme, you could use that in place and just increase the amount. And then, because gumbo usually has some kind of smoked meat, usually andouille sausage or something like that in it, to give it a lot of that rich smoky flavor, we wanted to still keep that even though we're not adding the meat. So I'm using liquid smoke, and I've got about a half a teaspoon of liquid smoke. You could increase that amount if you decided that you wanted that in more depth, as you could increase the amount of Tabasco if you found out that the amount that I added was insufficient for you. So that's what's going in here. And then the last ingredient, my favorite, is a pound of fresh okra. Now, if it's out of season and fresh okra is not available, you could use a pound of frozen okra. That works equally well. And then get this started up to a simmer. And we're going to turn that down and let it simmer for about 30 minutes. Gumbo is usually a fairly thick stewish dish or a really thick soup. However, the okra is going to continue to add some thickening, so as you're cooking, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit now. I've got 2 additional cups of broth. You could use 2 cups of water here, up to. You may not need it all. Add a little bit when it starts to simmer. Just keep your eye on it, and if it gets too thick for your taste, then add a little bit more and thin it down. After it's simmered for 30 minutes, it's ready to use. Generally, it's served over rice, so cook yourself up some rice while this is going, and this is what you end up with. This is a really fun dish. It's better the second day, as many things along this line are. It's Garbanzo and Okra Gumbo for Oklahoma Gardening. This is Barbara Brown.